Hello viewers, thank you for joining me, and Happy New Year! We're starting off 2022 with another really busy show. Occultic 9 is one of those anime where I looked back at the end and started struggling to form complete sentences even. There was just so much to go over, I couldn't figure out where to start. And it's true that not all of its many components were handled as well as others, but I did really like this one overall, so let's get into it. Occultic 9 takes place in an atmosphere of increased public interest in the occult, and each of our 9 focal characters relates to this atmosphere in their own way. Yuta is your pretty typical, somewhat timid, awkward teenager. He's a self-proclaimed NEET, trying to hide those insecurities behind his tech skills, insisting that he chose to become something of a social recluse. He runs a website that collects articles about supernatural happenings and mocks them. It's a haven for the non-believers, or just people too scared to allow themselves to consider otherwise. Yuta swears the occult is all nonsense, but he's definitely in the second camp, though his real top priority is the ad money he's hoping to collect, cashing in on the occult boom. Not exactly the admirable hero type our Yuta, but I did actually come to appreciate him by the end. I've really grown to have a soft spot for stories about flawed, ordinary people finding their courage and purpose in the world. I'll get into that later though. Yuta does have one friend, his research assistant, Ryoka. She's bubbly and supportive and tends to push him forward when he'd rather chicken out of something. And that's literally all I can reveal about her without spoiling the very end, unfortunately. Ryoka is, admittedly, probably the hardest character to sell. For a good long chunk of the series, she comes across like she was added for nothing more than fan service and a little comic relief. But I did find something endearing about her from the start. She balances Yuta in a way Yuta desperately needed. The first story we see them working on introduces us to Miyu, a girl at their school who tells fortunes on live streams. Miyu is sweet, and our first proof that supernatural happenings are very real in this universe. She doesn't fully understand her own abilities, but she's prone to visions of the future. There's something a little fragile about Miyu. It's a very modern method of getting her fortune-telling out there, and she's encountered some pretty harsh abuse online from people who think it's a scam. She's really kept going only thanks to encouragement from her best friend that her fortune-telling makes people happy, most of the time, and that makes it worth it. Miyu had a vision about Yuta being important to her future somehow, and she may not understand it, but she does have faith in her own abilities, so she starts tagging along when the first two approach her at school, and the story really takes off once Miyu's on board. The trio splits up for their next investigation. Ryoka and Miyu go meet focal character number 4. Arya is a troubled young girl who was studying black magic even before her brother died and she went a little off the rails. Now she runs a business cursing people. Arya is definitely one of the most morally questionable, but it was hard not to feel at least a little sympathetic for her once the series got into her backstory. Delving into that was the first task of character number 5. Toko is basically the opposite of Yuta in every way. She works for a professionally published magazine doing its best to prove all these occult incidents are real, and though they never really clash over it, she looks down on anyone who'd publish something they don't really believe in, like trying to exploit a recent surge in interest in the occult for money. Toko also gets us a better look at Professor Hashigami, who made his name in the field of science and engineering, but who's recently begun devoting all his time to finding a scientific explanation behind ghosts, out-of-body experiences, and other supernatural happenings. The kids had seen him on TV, taking place in some scientific debate. While the girls went to see Arya, Yuta went to the professor's office, hoping to interview him. And this is where Occultic 9 really starts, because when Yuta arrives, he finds the professor murdered. Yuta's father, who died when Yuta was young, used to be a popular radio station host. He left his son with a special radio box sort of thing, which Yuta's never been able to use. All that comes through is static. Until now, when a girl's voice suddenly starts barking orders. Yuta spotted the bloody knife before the body and picked it up for a better look. So now his fingerprints are all over the murder weapon and the crime scene, and he's never been great under pressure anyway, so it doesn't take much for him to cave to the voice's demands when she tells him he can either follow her orders or end up framed for the professor's murder. This mystery brings 3 more characters into play. One is Professor Hashigami's son, Sarai. The professor and his son were barely on speaking terms when he died. Sarai is very scientific and very much on the side of the non-believers. He lost a lot of respect for his father when his research turned to proving the supernatural. In fact, Sarai was one of the people calling in to harass Miyu on her live streams. Except she recovered and divined his fortune anyway, urging him to repair his relationship with his dad before it was too late, which, of course, he didn't heed, so he seeks them out to find out what she knew. Next we've got Shoon, my personal favorite, the baby-faced detective everyone always mistakes for a kid just playing dress-up. But he has earned his detective status. Shoon was always making progress towards solving the mysteries, but he was also just fun, high-spirited and playful. He tended to tease information out of people before they even realized they'd let their guard down. And one of the people Shoon starts investigating is Ririka, a college student who sells dojin on the side. Except one of her past work seems to portray this exact murder. She eventually tells him there was no real motivation or influence behind it, that the stories she writes comes from things she sees in dreams. That brings us up to 8. To be honest, there are 3 characters vying for that position as the 9th main in my mind, but none of them can be discussed without going into spoilers, so I'd say 8 is more than enough. The professor's death is only the beginning. Not long after, the town is shaken by a discovery of more than 250 bodies in the local lake. Things only get stranger as it's revealed that they all have the same cause of death, drowning, and they all died around the same time the previous night. Yet police are saying there are no signs of foul play. Our band of junior detectives, and one real one, find a code in the ceiling tiles of the professor's study at home that lists all the victims once it's deciphered. So they know the 2 events are connected somehow, and it only gets darker and crazier from there. I opened this review saying it was a very busy show. Having a million things going on at once can be hard to pull off in a series with only 12 episodes, and I can't deny that Occultic 9 struggles at times. Struggles to the point where I know it's turned some people away, and the first episode is especially rough. Not only are there all these characters to keep track of, but it's not all shown in chronological order. The montage of somewhat panicked news reports of all these bodies being pulled from the lake is actually the very first scene, and then the series pulls back about 2 weeks to just before the professor's death. It's the kind of show where it's pretty important to know the specific dates each event is taking place, but that information is only communicated to the viewer through screens that flash by in literally just a few seconds. The whole first episode feels kind of like it flashes by. We keep jumping from one character to the next, not even spending enough time with some of them to really get an idea of what their story is supposed to be. That one was just an unfortunate choice, I felt. We may have skipped around a bit, chronologically, but it's not like we spent half the tale in the future and half in the present or anything. It wasn't that extreme. There's no reason they couldn't have laid out the story in a more straightforward way and introduced some of these characters along the way. They didn't need to all be thrown at us at once. And then the characters themselves made a point to throw as much information at you as humanly possible. Yuta was a particularly bad offender. It got so bad that I literally stopped the first episode in the middle to make sure I didn't have it set to double speed by accident. They were talking that fast. The pacing settles down a little as it goes on. At the very least, we start spending longer segments with each of the characters. It is off-putting, though, and I hate when a show creates obstacles for itself like that. In this era where so many anime come out each season, it's important to make a good first impression, and Occultic 9 isn't winning any awards on that front. Not that I ever want to skip over a show's flaws, but I'm not really selling this one, am I? I really enjoyed Occultic 9, and immediately after finishing it, all I wanted to talk about were the things I loved. I love supernatural-themed things. I love murder mysteries. I love big casts of characters and intertwining stories like this, even when it gets a little choppy. And I never used to be much of a fan of sci-fi, but I've really started to appreciate when shows blend the genres and give their magic scientific explanations. Occultic 9 really leans hard into that. So yes, all shows are imperfect in some way. This one's imperfections can be a little hard to overlook, but I still suggest checking it out if you're also a fan of supernatural mysteries. I enjoyed it enough that there are absolutely some things I want to discuss in more detail. This is officially where the spoilers start. Occultic 9 opens with the lake incident, though by the time we come back around to it at the end of episode 3, there was so much else going on that I'd almost forgotten about it. I loved seeing the mystery come together, and I loved seeing all these very different people work together to solve it. There are some characters who never get enveloped into this team, and I really wanted to see them all come together at some point, because some characters just have a different feel once they're part of a group. Sarai was one I found myself surprised to be growing fond of. He's definitely one of the most unapproachable when he's first introduced, but once he starts spending time with all these other, much goofier teenagers, it softened my image of him a bit. He's very intense, and always so serious. He's probably always struggled to make friends. It made me feel a little warm and fuzzy, seeing him with this group, even with all the dark things going on. And there was another mini side plot of Sarai and Yuta bonding over their dead dads that I also really liked. Before going deeper into the other characters, I have to mention the plot twist at the heart of this story. Episode 3 ends with the bodies being pulled from the lake, and then, at the end of episode 6, our heroes have deciphered the code with all the victims' names, and found another surprise waiting for them. Our protagonists are 8 of the 256 bodies pulled from the lake. They're all dead. They've been pretty isolated, trying to solve the professor's murder, and all the other victims are wandering around as ghosts too, mostly unaware, so there are people they could still interact with, making it a little more believable that they didn't immediately catch on. But after this discovery, they try to head back to their normal lives, only to find that Sarai's mom, Shoon's colleagues, Toko's boss, they're invisible to them all, so they slowly start to accept their ghost status and try to figure out where they go from here, and how they ended up in the lake in the first place, ultimately diving into one of the theories the professor was working on, that ghosts and living people can exist on the same plane, just at different frequencies, and they start to see some hope for a way back when they realize ghosts perceive time differently. Even this spoiler section isn't going to go into everything. There's just too much to cover, but this is enough to talk about some of the others. Once Shoon's out of the official picture, the detectives bring in Asuna, a young psychometrist who I like to consider the 9th protagonist. I tend to consider Ryoka and her other self as one character, and we'll get into the other candidate, I just feel like Asuna has the most presence as an individual. She worked with Shoon and cares about avenging him, but isn't really tied down to another character the way Aveline and Kiryu are. Plus, psychometry, the ability to see a person's memories by touching something that belonged to them, has always been a really cool power to me, so I guess I'm a little biased too. And it doesn't hurt that it's given a bit more of an explanation and a lot more focus than Miyu's visions or Ririka's dreams. I tend to call them our protagonists or heroes, but that's not totally accurate for some of them. There's a lot of story Occultic 9 tries to cram into 12 episodes, and some characters definitely got the short end of the stick. Ririka is barely explored at all, to the point where it's possible she was actually working with the villains, but I honestly don't know. The series doesn't give us enough to confirm that. She disappears at the end with a smile that could be seen as evil, but they might have been going for mischievous too. Arya's fate is also left a little open-ended. This one was more disappointing to me, because she gets a lot of focus in the beginning. Arya Kuranino is almost like a stage name for her black magic business. Once upon a time, she was Rhea Minase, the youngest child of a very wealthy family. She was left in the care of her older brother after their parents died in an accident. The attachment she had to him was definitely a little unhealthy, but understandable after losing their parents and the other bullying and abuse she dealt with at school. But then she started getting sick. The illness isn't specified, but it ended in a kidney transplant from her brother, who ended up dead after some sort of complication with the anesthesia. This was the last straw for Rhea, who stole his body out of the morgue and took it home with her. Her journal entries over the next year were pretty horrifying, as she flip-flopped between being totally delusional, thinking they were still living happily together, while other entries were all about Rhea trying to find the source of the horrible smell as his body decomposed. A neighbor eventually intervened and forced her back to reality, but that only left her suicidal. She was about to jump in front of a train when a mysterious voice stopped her. This voice belonged to Kiryu Kusakabe, who was just an ordinary man until recently, when he got caught up in an explosion at a factory, handling the material that would later be used to experiment on all the people who ended up in the lake. Since his recovery, he's been able to leave his body and travel around in spirit form. Arya, in all her gloom, decides he must be the devil, and the two start up their business, cursing people. Kiryu does end up having some really important information that helps our main crew solve the time mystery, but he and Arya feel pretty separate from everything else. He starts seeing her brother's memories, and they discover he was hospitalized for the explosion at the same time they were doing the kidney transplant surgery. Kiryu ended up with some of her brother's organs after his death, linking them in some spiritual way. Ultimately, Arya isn't one of the ones who gets to return to life. We're kind of left to assume it was by choice, though, that she's happier in the afterlife with Kiryu standing in as her older brother figure. But personally, I wanted better for her. And at last, I want to talk about Yuta a little. He's always the first to bring up that he's not exactly hero material, and he's not wrong. Yuta's a bit of a whiny coward, to be honest, and most of the story is carried along by his smarter, braver friends. But I've come to really enjoy stories about ordinary people growing to be those hero types, so I warmed up to him by the end. Between coming to terms with his father's death, guilt over chickening out of the ordeal that taught Miyu to be brave, and his desire to finally do something meaningful with his life, I was already proud of him by the time he decided to confront the organization behind it all. It took a while, but he earned his hero status in the end, and he is kind of the most vocal of our main protagonists, so this show definitely would have had a different feel to it if he'd never shaped up. This went on a lot longer than I'd anticipated. They really did stuff a lot into 12 episodes, and there was no avoiding some of it being rushed. I would have liked even just one more episode to spread some of it out, maybe give some sort of explanation for what Ririka was up to, or at least make Yuta's fate a little clearer. It really did feel like they just ran out of time at the end. Occultic 9 was one of those anime that was really well suited to my personal tastes. I understand why it's not making waves as this widely acknowledged, amazing show. The places it falls short are pretty hard to ignore, but I suggest giving it a try if it sounds interesting. I had a good time with this one. Thank you for watching.